because I had some questions about the final project. Not have to really worry about the final project quite so soon, but maybe toward the middle of March is when you have to make sure you start getting those project teams formed. Um, there is a list of possibilities of things that I've picked out as like some good algorithms to explore that, but they're that I'm willing to discuss other algorithms if there's one that you have in mind that kind of fits the course. Generally, I've picked a bunch of nature inspired algorithms that we won't cover in the course that then give you an opportunity to explore and then present a little report on as part of the final project with your two-person group. But you could also take something that we have talked about in the course and consider an extension of it. So there's a bunch of things that I've presented that are kind of the basic version, and then people have extended it. So we'll talk about particle swarm optimization not that long a time. We won't talk about chaotic catfish particle swarm optimization. And so, exploring the differences between chaotic catfish particle swarm optimization and vanilla particle swarm optimization would be a fine final project topic as an example. Otherwise, in the more short term, Muddy's Point Sunday, Concept Check 2, a Sunday, and Mini Project 2 do a week from Sunday. So Mini Project 1 was the only one that was required, or at least the only one that wouldn't be dropped. And then all the other mini projects, I think you only have to do 2 or 3 of them because I think 5 are dropped and there's about 8 total. So Mini Project 2 is the one that's focusing on Unit 2's topics. And so that is something that is available for you to do, but it's also totally fine to skip that and wait for another one. So those are our admin topics. So any questions? All right, so we left off talking about evolutionary programming last time, and we mentioned that evolutionary programming provides a way to automatically evolve finite state machines, which any computer program is a finite state machine. So, and then there's a bunch of other things that are finite state machines as well. We'll talk about decision trees and so on. So, because evolutionary programming has no crossover operator, all you have to do is figure out a way to mutate individuals in your population. And so with finite state machines, you can add states, you can remove states, you can add edges, remove edges, and so on. And, and then it will then compete different subpopulations of mutants against each other. And those mutants, because there's no crossover, you can kind of think of them as species competing for the niche that is your optimization objective. And so they're not sampling from each other, but some mutants will go off in one direction, other mutants will go off in another direction, but the mutants that will survive will hopefully be the ones that fulfill your objective. And so the example there was like a natural language processing task where you're predicting the next word from a set of words. And so you feed in a bunch of symbols, and then you get a prediction out of your finite state machine of what the next word is going to be. If you do that with a bunch of test cases, so a bunch of sentences, then you reward the finite state machine that is a better predictor than the others, generate mutant offspring of it that populate the population more than the others, and so on and so forth. And then eventually you hopefully get a finite state machine that has been evolved to do your task. This is very much like training a neural network to do exactly the same task. But with a neural network, you might be using back propagation, so following gradients and all of that. And so this is a way to show how you can do effectively the same thing with an evolutionary approach. Now, the thing about evolutionary programming is that I've already mentioned is that it gets rid of crossover, because if you have general objects like finite state machines, it's difficult to come up with a crossover operator. So if you have a parent finite state machine that's got 3 states and another parent finite state machine that's got 300 states, then and all sorts of different links between them, there's no easy way to define a crossover operation, a way to blend between those two. So it's just easier to consider them as to being separate species that don't ever mate, and then instead just reproduce kind of clonally with mutation. But crossover would be a nice thing to have. And so genetic programming provides a way to add crossover so that you can actually blend different parents, which are expressed as raw code. So it's kind of doing two things. For one, it's it's preventing us from having to just use the finite state machine formalism, so that we can actually go into raw code that might be human readable and kind of follow a certain flow, which might make it more generally applicable. And then two, allows us to borrow all the benefits of crossover that we've learned about in the genetic algorithm. But we have to figure out how to do crossover without screwing up, like creating a bunch of syntax errors. Because if I have like 5-line code over here, like, if I had, code like, while, I is less than 5, I equals I plus 1, or I equals I minus 1, end. And if I had code over here that was something like, J equals X plus 6, um, you know, uh, uh, Y is equal to 7, X is equal to J times Y. If I wanted to do crossover, for one, how do I do that? And two, how do I get code that has no syntax errors? Because you can imagine that if I were to say, take this first line of code, and, like one way you could think of doing crossover might be to say, well, I'll just say this is one line of code, this is one line of code. We'll use a different color for that. Use blue, maybe. So here's, the I just separate, like generate a crossover point. If I were to try to cross these things over, so let's say that I try to just do crossover here, where my offspring are going to look like the parents, except it's going to be J equals X plus 6, and then I equals I minus 1 end on one side. But then on the other side, it's while I is less than 5, but Y equals 7, X equals J times Y over here. That's going to generate these syntax errors because now I've got this logical block here that while end, I can't break those things up. So I can't just simply create a crossover point in the middle and swap this code and expect to get functioning code out. That would be like, if we think about this, in terms of natural systems, this would be like a crossover between, between chromosomes that generates something that is just developmentally infeasible, so that it dies before it can even, start developing into a functioning organism. And so we don't want to just try this crossover over and over and over again until we manage to get some functioning code, because it's just going to have so many errors that it's just not going to be feasible. So this is not an option that we can use. So this is just not feasible. Not feasible. So then how do we manage to use real code and crossover simultaneously so that we can frequently, when we get out of crossover, get code out that has no syntax errors that can then be run and evaluated for function, not just for whether or not it runs? So there's a couple different ways you can approach this problem or do this problem. And so one approach is to use what we call linear genetic programming. So one solution is linear genetic programming. So how many in here have ever taken like a computer architecture course? A couple, yeah. So there's a lot of the CS side. And once upon a time, it was pretty common to talk in architecture courses about these different architectures like CISC, complex instruction set computers, and RISC, reduced instruction set computers. It's still sort of a historical topic. It's maybe not quite as focal as it used to be back in the day. But there was and so this used to come up. How many people have heard of OISC? one instruction set computers? Anybody? So this used to be a thing that would be a common topic because it's sort of like a severely reduced instruction set computer. So so this is and that's the example that I'll get to here. But basically, what before I show that example, just in words, what you can create, we'll call them programming languages. You can create artificial architectures that use where every line sort of stands on its own. So there's no blocks of code. So you can create registers and memory addresses that you access so that every single line, instead of creating a list of connected statements, instead the side effects of these lines get put into memory addresses and registers that are acted on by every single instruction set. So because of that, then you can just have every line can end up standing alone and not requiring the assistance of any other lines. So one example of that, and this wasn't created for genetic programming, this existed before that, it just happened to be very convenient, is the so-called one instruction set computer, or known as OISC. So if you've heard of CISC and RISC, this is like a severe case of RISC, where in this case, the entire, you can think of it as an entire assembly language has a single instruction. And one example of that is the so-called subtract and branch if negative, or SBN. And there are a bunch of one instruction set computers, and they all would have the same property. They all would work fine with linear genetic programming. This is just the first one. Back when I was a student, this was the most popular one that was talked about. So it's the one that I use. But again, there's a bunch of these if you look up OISCs. And so what subtraction branch if negative does is if you were to imagine again an assembly language where you've got an instruction like S, B, N, and then you pass it in addresses, memory addresses, for example. So A, comma B, comma C. What this instruction does is it will do this. It will say, all right, whatever is in memory location A, I'm going to subtract off whatever's in memory location B. And then if the A result afterwards is less than 0, then go to location C for next instruction. That's the so-called subtract and branch if negative. It turns out that this, like many other OISCs, is so-called Turing complete. So this here is Turing complete. And all that means is that you can do anything anything that you need to do on a computer, you can do with that single line. So I don't want to do a bunch of examples of this, but let's just say, for example, you wanted to do something that maybe in another instruction set, another assembly language might be move AB, which would be, or maybe I'll just use different letters here. I'll say move XY, which would be the equivalent of saying like X equals Y. If I just wanted to do that, then I can do that with my subtract and branch if negative. I can say that, well, let's say that already in memory, I've loaded in to some location that I'll call A, the value of X, and I've loaded into some location I call B, the value of Y. Um, and so if I start from there, I could say, well, subtract and branch if negative. And then I'm going to, I've got another location that I've just called neg B. So I'm just going to say neg B. And then that one I'm going to put into it. And neg B started out as 0. So I guess I can say neg B has 0 in it. Then I'm going to subtract from it whatever's in B. And then I'll say if negative, I'll go to location next. But location next, I'm going to just make the next location. So it automatically goes to the next location, regardless if this is negative or not. So all this is going to do is basically going to put into neg B is going to be 0, which is the previous value of neg B, minus the value of y, and which will be negative y. And so that seems like a weird thing to do. But then in my next line, I'll do a subtractive branch of negative, and I'm going to pass it in the location of A twice. And then I've got a next, my next label for my program counter is next to, which will just be this next line. And so here, this is just going to clear A, basically. So then A is going to be equal to, yeah, A is going to be equal to 0 after this, because it's just going to take whatever was in A, subtract it from whatever was in A, and load it in as 0. And it doesn't matter really what I have here. But I could have put any label there, but it happens to be the next line, but that's not negative, so it'll never branch there, but it goes there anyway. So then now, finally, I can do what I wanted to do, where I say SBN A neg B, and then I'll say done is my last label, where done will go here. And it's just whatever the next instruction would be. So I'll leave it blank. And so what this will end up doing is that it'll store in A will end up being 0 minus negative y, which will be equal to y. So I basically said that hey, I used to store X in wherever A was. Now I store Y. So I've managed to move that over. And we can do this game with anything, subtraction, addition, multiplication, whatever you can do in Python, you can do in SBN. But it just might take lots and lots and lots and lots of lines. But the beauty of an approach like this is that all of the side effects are contained within one single line. So that means you could have parents that have like 10 lines of SBN code, and another parent that has 100 lines of SBN code. And you can just take an arbitrary set of lines from one and insert it into the other, and it's still executable. So you don't have to worry about syntax errors when you do crossover. So this allows for crossover with no syntax errors. And so I'll get to your question in a second. So all of the code will always be executable. So then you can just judge it on how functional it is, and then just put that back in your fitness function. Question. Yeah, that's a good point. Is that that it doesn't have to be that it really that it's there's I don't want to say that there's going to be yeah, generally speaking, even without the one instruction set, there's going to be lots of other languages that have this feature. I would say that there's less danger of weird side effects when you have an architecture like this then one that has been structured in such a way that there's maybe certain sets of things that need to happen right next to each other. So, I mean, off the top of my head, I can't give you I can't give you an example like this one that, say, for x86 assembly would cause such a catastrophic error. But it's something that I guess that I think you're right that I think most assembly languages are going to be able to cope with this. I just to be able to prove that this is not always the case, I'm not confident with saying that standing up here in front of you. You're probably right, but traditionally speaking, linear genetic programming has favored these sorts of languages because there's absolutely sort of a guarantee that there's never going to be harm because every line looks like every other line. Well, you might, just like when you do your mutation operators, for example, you're going to have to bound, let's say, the operators here. These would be sort of like alleles or nucleotides, even that so that they don't go outside of a memory range or something like that. So, of course, those things you definitely have to bound so that your solution is feasible. But your feasibility checker doesn't need to check for sort of like syntax correctness. It can just check for sort of these simple things like if these three arguments are within the right bounds, that's easy. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. I mean, you can every line of this code, I mean, you could create if you have so I guess I'll mention this with two things. So as a result, mutation is easy. So you just sort of, mutate operators, um, first of all, mutate arguments, maintaining feasibility. So you can almost think of, it's almost like the arguments are like nucleotides within genes. And then for crossover, then you've got like you might have parent A here and parent B here, and parent A is going to have a bunch of these SBN lines, and then so will parent B. And they might be different lengths, but all you need to do is to pick a crossover point on one and a crossover point on the other, and then to get your offspring, then you just depending on what your crossover operator does, let's say it just will swap the bottom halves here. So then you just swap this half for this half, and then that will generate your offspring A and your offspring B, which will just have the same top, but then they'll have different swapped bottom. And this is guaranteed to have no syntax errors. Hmm. Hmm. Well, right. So that would be if you, so in this case, like that would be if you had like, an x86 assembly, you might have like a move XY and a move YX. You'd have all of those. But here, all you've got is the SBN. So there might be groups of them that do the move operation. Hmm. Right. 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 It might completely break the operation. Hmm. Well, so this is there's the idea here is that you might have if you have very, very long strings, you may have some function that is achieved at the top of one that is broken at the bottom. And in another one, it might have some function which is broken at the top and fixed at the bottom. And then by swapping those, then you hopefully get some offspring that might actually have things that are fixed in both locations. So it's not in these, like, it's not so much about these four-line examples, but it's this idea that if you have a very, very long program, then now you can sort of mix. You might have more success in different regions, and you don't have to sort of have, if you have the mutation only strategy, then you've got this line where you're trying to solve all of the problems like in one place, and you're hoping for just sort of all of the mutations to accumulate just in one place that all do the right thing. But with crossover, you have the ability to sort of, if you get something right via mutation here, you then can borrow something that happened independently in another line, and likewise, and so on and so forth. And the swaps that result in sufficient in much, much better offspring will end up being kept around, whereas the swaps that accumulate the kind of bad mutations will get purged out of the situation. So it breaks what we call linkage. So it creates linkage disequilibrium so that hopefully good stuff can accumulate and bad stuff can accumulate, and bad stuff can be purged and good stuff can be kept. But that does bring up one of the interesting things that people find is that when you use this linear genetic programming, and the punchline here is the type of genetic programming that are sort of modernly used is not this, but when you use linear genetic programming, this becomes much, much faster when you have so-called introns. So this is borrowed from genetics. There's some terms borrowed from genetics. We've got introns, and these are regions of DNA that do not encode for proteins. So we can kind of call them no-ops. They're non-operational. And then we've got exons, which are DNA that codes for proteins. So the introns means that name comes from its in between exons. So in your DNA, there's in the old days, they used to call this, used to be called junk DNA. Because there would just be these, because remember I said in genes you've got these codons and you've got start codons and stop codons. So you can have a bunch of genes where you have start, codon, stop, and then that whole thing, if you start there, it'll generate a protein, then you hit the end and stop. But then in between that stop codon and some other start codon from another gene, there can be other DNA that doesn't actually get touched or doesn't actually end up producing any proteins. And so for a long time, people were not sure what this stuff is for. It was just sort of an accident that, just happens to accumulate, and it's not really costing that much to keep this around. I mean, it does cost a lot because you have to copy it. So there could be a huge number of base pairs that you're just stuck with, that you have to keep copying even though they don't do anything. But then people over time found that these introns had some function. They had some additional regulatory function. Maybe they actually just helped at a longer time scale, that those that had the introns might have had sort of more evolvable DNA because it provided more flexibility, for example. So there's all sorts of hypothesized reasons for these introns, what they're there. So they're probably not junk anymore. Interestingly enough, in linear genetic programming, there's something very similar about that, is that it turns out that in these linear genetic programs, You can have introns and extrons as well. So you can have introns too, introns and exons. So these are like lines of code that are never executed. So, for example, this could be a long string of lines of code where whatever happens right before it always branches over it. So, like if you were to go down through that, there's a couple of lines that just happen to have a branching statement that branch 100 lines down. And whatever's in the middle there, it doesn't matter what's in there because the stuff that's up here that, right before it is preserved, is conserved. And so it always ends up jumping over that. So you can have interesting stuff happening in this region of code that is not used anywhere. This actually can apply not just for linear genetic programs, but you could, of course, have while false blocks in the middle of your code. And it seems silly to have a while false block, but I mean, some of us might know if we need to quickly comment out, a line of, a bunch of lines of code, and maybe we don't have a really nice IDE that can quickly, comment them out like that. Then maybe we do just, temporarily. Now we don't want to leave it in there, but might just quickly change, a while, true statement to while false and or something like that, just because we want to comment that stuff out temporarily. Well, that stuff can get stuck inside the code. So you can create these introns. And what they found is that when code, so when programs have many introns, then you find that these linear genetic programs end up converging faster on high quality solutions. So that's kind of interesting. It's almost like it's just this, it's like it's like having a little archive of potentially useful stuff that you kind of keep around with you that you potentially can cross over into later. So it's like what you can do is you can create these regions of code which currently are not functional. They don't provide any useful function, but they almost provide a useful function. But you kind of branch over them until they actually start being functional. So you can imagine what happens is these introns mutate, they mutate, they mutate. And while they're non-functional, there are going to be offspring that might cross over and turn them into functional. And then when you evaluate those offspring, they have super low fitness because now they've added in this junk code that doesn't do anything useful, and they get purged from the population. But you still can accumulate in the offspring where those are no ops, where those things are branched over, where they're not actually doing anything. That stuff can keep mutating. And so it allows for this little laboratory where you can keep accumulating these mutations. And at the point where you suddenly gain a useful function, when they get crossed over into it, then those offspring suddenly have a massive advantage, not an incremental advantage, because it like is totally different than what they used to have, and that allows them to kind of leapfrog. So, and that seems to be what's happening in the case of this junk code in these linear programs. So it's kind of an interesting thing, and maybe hints at maybe some of the functions of what might be going on in real natural systems with the introns there. All right, so that's linear genetic programming, and that's kind of the idea here is that there are ways to encode things as strings where you can use not only mutation but crossover and basically use the standard genetic algorithm that we talked about, but instead of applying it to strings of numbers, you try it to strings of instructions. Now, we'd like to get to the point where we don't have to force everyone to write an assembly language, and so that is our next step. So questions about this? Yeah. Well, there's some feasibility things that still have to keep track of when you do these swaps. And so if you've got, labels for line numbers that you're branching into and things like that, then you may need to make sure that those are maintained. So I'm glossing over a few things here, but But generally speaking, if you use these approaches, those are relatively easy hurdles to get over. Whereas if you tried to implement crossover with a more structured procedural language like this, then it is very difficult to figure out how do I break a while loop in half. And so rather than trying to figure out what all these possible failures could be, and then coming up with crossovers that, well, I'm going to crossover, but always the guts of the while loop are the things that get crossed over or something like that. And then that then is a problem because then your crossover, what if you want your crossover to cross over in the middle of this, like you want your predicate to change, but you want the while loop to stay the same. Well, how do I do that? Well, then there's not really a good way to do that. So those problems are much easier to solve here. And there are, again, like, so if there's no next in the offspring, well, I need to maybe deal with that. So maybe I don't encode these as these symbolic labels. Maybe I have to encode this as +1. So it goes down one line, and that, if I wanted to go next two from here, it'd be +2. Well, then those I could swap over with no problem. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. Hmm. Well, if there's a 1 point, there'd be two. If you had two parents and 1 point crossover, you get two offspring. So then you have two parents and two offspring, perhaps. Hmm. Right? Well, I mean, that's it. It is a way of we know that. The, I mean, it's that's. I mean, one of the kind of puzzles to biology is why sex exists, because you have perfectly good DNA and other perfectly good DNA, and it makes no sense to just pinch them at an arbitrary point and swap, and then your offspring are necessarily going to get better. And so what happens though is that um, if you have the right architect, like so initially when these things run, you are going to effectively weed out architectures where crossover that aren't very modular. And the only architectures of these codes that are going to survive this process are going to have a certain amount of modularity. And that, because otherwise you're always going to be breaking up good solutions. So that will be a consequence of this, is that the types of code that will end up evolving from this may not, there may be other solutions out there that they just aren't compatible with sex. But this allows for us to imagine that, well, if we did have modular code where we've got a bunch of modules that are working and another module that's sort of compartmentalized that is not quite working, then maybe there's a way to sort of focus the innovation there, and this would be kind of a way to do that. But like I said, there are better ways to do this, and this is what we're going to introduce next, the kind of modern way to do genetic programming. Any other questions about this? I mean, basically, I was just trying to motivate that in order to do crossover, you got to get back to some representation where you can do these points and swap. The simplest way to do that is put everything back into strings. But programs aren't, naturally strings. So, you might, but there are some languages that are string-like. But how do we do this to more general languages? And so then that's when we're going to generate, introduce then the kind of modern, more generic genetic programming. So I'll say modern genetic programming. And I'll maybe switch to a color other than red. And so there are other ways that we can encode complex syntax. And if you've ever had to write a compiler, for example, then you've probably had to write a parser as part of that. And if you've ever had to write a parser, then you had to struggle with how to represent lines of code so that you can kind of make sense of them as you're reading them down through them, and then figure out, at what point does if I'm running, like if I'm writing an interpreter, at what point do I actually start executing things as opposed to just figuring out what the instructions are and so on. And a tool for that doing that is the so-called abstract syntax tree, or AST. And this is going to then turn code, any code, into a tree where the nodes have particular types, and then the subtrees that hang down from them are sort of isolated from everything that's above them. And that is what's going to make crossover work. So as an example, let's say I have a simple instruction 5 times 2. Well, I can represent that as an abstract syntax tree that is rooted at the multiplication operator, which takes its 2 arguments, 5 and 2. Now, let's say I have a different line of code, um, or lines of code, like while. This is very similar to the line that I started with. While I is greater than 5, we'll do um, I equals, well, I think I'll just do less than 5. Or no, I'll do greater than 5. That's right. I'll do then I is equal to I minus 1, end. Well, this I can represent as a tree as well. So I'm going to root it at the while. And then I have to think, well, what are the arguments for the while? Well, the while takes um, basically its predicate as one argument and the block of code is the other argument. So the while's predicate is itself a tree, which is rooted at greater than, which itself takes arguments I and 5. And on the other side, the block of code um, here is basically just an assign statement. So it'll say assign. And then that takes that assignment statement is going to say, well, what are you assigning to? That's I. What's on the right-hand side of the assignment statement? Well, that in itself is the output of a subtraction. What is on that subtraction? Well, that is I, and then it is 1. So now I have 2 tree representations of the same code above here. And so each one of these nodes has I'll say each of the nodes has a type. So you can kind of see here that, this is going to return a number. The assignment statement, though, may not return anything. So it sort of has this assign type. This returns a Boolean. So each one of these you can assign a type. And as long as any subtree is rooted at the same type, you could swap in any other subtree that is rooted at that same type there, and it would be syntactically correct code. And so with that, we can, mutation is relatively easy. You could, if I want to mutate any node here, I just can create random subtrees that are rooted at the same type. So I could mutate this one just by drawing another number. I could mutate this one by drawing an operator that returns a number, like a minus. So I could maybe put a minus here, but then as long as I complete that tree, so that now I, have something that fills out that. And so for mutation, I could modify this in all sorts of ways. But what's also cool about this is I can now crossover, because if I pick a subtree out of one side that has that its root has the same type as a subtree of another side, I can swap those subtrees, and that's how I do crossover. So mutation, just random additions or changes that agree with type, and then crossover is swap subtrees rooted at same type. So let me do an example of that. So as an example, if I were to say so what I mean by rooted at same type, so this is my kind of crossover cartoon here, is if I had a tree like this, I'm gonna color this one dark, indicating it's some other type. And if I have a tree, another parent that looks, say, like this, and the shape here doesn't matter that much. The point here is that both of these are going to have a black node, a filled node. Let's say this one maybe looks like this. Again, it doesn't really matter what this shape here. If I call these two parents, then I can identify that, oh, here's a subtree that is rooted at whatever type is represented by the filled circle. Here's a subtree that's also rooted by that same type. And so now I can swap these, and this is our crossover, to get two new syntactically correct offspring that I can then execute to evaluate for function. So a concrete example of that is I could start out with parents like, maybe I'll move this word over a little bit to give myself a little room so I can keep this on the same page. I'll just erase. So as an example, I could have a parent that, um, and you could imagine many, many more operations here, but if I just am thinking about two lines of code, I could have something that's like 2x plus 3.14. And on the other side, the other parent might be x cosine of 4.5. Now, 4.5 and 2x have the same effective type. So what crossover is going to do is, so this could produce offspring, which will be 4.5 plus 3.14 and x cosine 2x. And so we've just swapped these two right here. So we have our two parents producing our two offspring. And that's the general idea. Any questions about that? That we can represent pretty much any code as a tree, and once it's in this abstract syntax tree, then we have easy ways to mutate, and we also have easy ways to do crossover. And this allows for, yeah, question? Right. Well, I mean, so if this is, say, a statically typed language, then you might know that this is a float, and we might know that x is also a float, and so when you multiply x by 2, then that's also a float. So in the language, then even if they're not strongly typed, if they're weakly typed, it's still known when you run your parser. It's a relatively automated process where you can go through and you can go down and say, okay, so I know that this variable is of this type. I know that this literal is of this type. And so as you use that information, when you go down through the code, you then generate a data structure which represents this, and this can all be done in an automated way. And it'll generate this abstract syntax tree behind the scenes where each node is labeled with its type. which just can be read right off of the code. So, integer, float, Boolean, um, operation, etc. Block. So you could imagine each one of these different kind of compatible types where anything that matches that type, like any float could go here without violating. I mean, that's the whole point of um, context-free grammars. So most programming languages are going to fit into this so-called CFGs, context-free grammars, which basically say this operator takes a certain thing on the left and a certain thing on the right. It can take any integer, any float, any float. So as long as you start out with syntactically correct code, and if you know what the context-free grammar is, then you can create these syntax trees which capture all of those type relationships and encode them, all of that same information up here. So then later you can then operate on these data structures by mutating them, by just randomly picking types that fit, or crossing over where, going down through the tree and finding one type and then going down through the tree and finding another type that's the same type and then swapping. Does that answer your question? Yeah. That's right. So rather than saying that we're going to create a 1-point crossover at 3 lines down in the code, it becomes a little more dynamic. So you have to randomly find these crossover points, but that's actually much more like what goes on. And this doesn't matter that it's much more like, but that actually is much more like what goes on during meiosis, where when the chromosomes come together, they actually random points end up coming together to do that crossover. It's not always the same point where things cross over. Any more questions about that? Is it pretty clear how that works? Hmm. Well, so I mean, so like in this case, there are two parents, and we picked 2 points to do this crossover, and or we picked 1 point in each, and that's where we brought things together, and that produced these two offspring. So, but you can design crossover in different ways. I mean, in an evolution strategy where crossover is implemented by weighting, by convex combinations, then you can have 8 parents, effectively, because you're just blending all of them together. Here you could imagine picking 6 points. So I need to find 6 nodes here, and then find 6 mating nodes here of the same type, and then I'm just going to swap each one of those. That would still produce two offspring, but they would have 6 swaps difference between their parents. 2 parents, yeah. So this is parent A. So this is parent A, and this is parent B. This is offspring A, and this is offspring B. So mom, dad, brother, sister. Twins. Mom, dad, fraternal twins. Okay. Other questions? Of course, you can have more than two, but anyway. Yes. Yeah, okay, that's a good point. So things like divide by zero, um, either so right. So um, it may be that you get a division by zero error, and if that's a possibility, so that you might imagine that there's some ways you could protect for that. But if it's a possibility that some of your offspring might end up getting divide by zero errors, then that just needs to be caught. So you just have to have a way that you can capture that error, and you say, this offspring gets a divide by zero error. I guess it didn't make it to be born. It just, so that will naturally call out if you have a mutation or a crossover that generates a bunch of those types of catastrophic errors, then they're just going to be flushed from the population. Question in the back? That's right. Right. Well, right. So that's a good question. Is that at least in natural systems, how do you protect from crossover? And the the mechanism and the function can be kind of tricky. So one of the things that happens in meiosis is that chromosomes come together, and the chromosomes that engage in this stuff get held together by this thing called a centromere. And so if you've ever seen chromosome pairs drawn, sometimes you see them drawn kind of in this like Y shape. And this is helping me too much here. It kind of looks like this. Um, and and this thing in the middle is this centromere, which is just something that coordinates the two chromosomes together. It turns out there is a bunch of effectively junk DNA that allows for these two Lego pieces to connect at this point. And there's a bunch of stuff that is doesn't appear to be very functional around that centromere because it turns out it's really hard to fix functions that are around there because it turns out that it's really hard to cross over right near the centromere. So you typically cross over on the longer end of this combination. Um, and then there's also sort of edge effects, like how close you get towards the edge of that. So there are basically regions of this homologous pair where it is more likely to get crossover and less likely to get crossover. That sets up the opportunity for really important things to somehow get moved into regions of the DNA that are more protected from crossover. That is one mechanism that could allow for that. But it may also be that, there could be other ways to do that. Like you've got actually 23 pairs of chromosomes. You've got, your heart is actually lots and lots and lots of genes participate in your heart. They're not actually like all on the same chromosome. They're scattered across multiple, so it might be very difficult. And both parents have the same allele. Like there might not be a lot of variation in that. If it's really really important, everybody might have it. And so if you cross over, there might not be anything new to swap in. You might do the swap, but you might actually just be copying something that's already from one parent into the other parent, and you have no difference in that. So it is really important that if you had to, so this is why what we'll get to eventually for say multi-objective optimization and so on is if you have two candidate solutions that are wildly different. So again, like an air vehicle and a ground vehicle. My manufacturing system, if you configure the parameters right, will either build a drone or it'll build a car. But how I configure my manufacturing system, that's all in my chromosome. It may be that if that it will just never ever be useful to take a car candidate and cross it with a drone candidate because those parameters just completely incompatible. So you'll get a bunch of wasted computational effort doing the crossover because the offspring will always be non-viable. So in some advanced solutions for genetic algorithms, they have a way of making so the crossover only happens among solutions which are relatively close together. So you can calculate kind of a distance between this solution. And so if the kind of L2 norm of this, multivariate vector solution is within a certain radius, then these things it's okay, we'll let crossover go. But if they're way different, like a pig and a cow or something like that, then in that case we're going to prevent genes from interacting by way of crossover, in much the same way that two different species can't mate. And that's another way that to answer your original question about the natural systems, wildly different architectures, physiological architectures, you don't have to worry about crossover because there are other mechanisms in place that just prevent mating to begin with. And that is the best way. So you can still have organisms that are mutating and try to better invade niches, but those organisms, if you've got a slug and a dog, there's just no way for those two things to mate. So you don't ever have to worry about crossover there. Yeah. Hmm. Oh, gotcha. Within that's an interesting question. That I would say that there's not within genetic programming. What we'll talk about probably next time, we'll start is in immunocomputing, which is the next sort of genetic adjacent way we're going to talk about computational creativity. Is that it it has to have ways for candidates to come up with kind of novel solutions. And it's inspired by what goes on in your adaptive immune system. And so you have to create, in order to constantly build up immunity to new things that your ancestors haven't seen, your body is constantly rolling dice. And it's trying to create these new antibodies that match antigens that it's never seen before. And what's cool about it is inside your body, it doesn't use mutation to do this. It uses something called VDJ recombination, which we'll get to again probably next time. But the kind of preview of that is there are portions of your DNA that have basically they're like random number generators or pseudo random number generators. There's like a huge amount of variation, which then can be resampled using a type of non-sexual crossover inside your body. And that reshuffling is what allows your body to generate antibodies of all sorts of different types that it could then test against antigens that are discovered in the world. And that is a little bit like, it's the closest thing I have right now off the top of my head to what you're asking for, is that inside one individual, inside one candidate solution, you actually have sort of hypothetical solutions being generated without sex just by recombining stuff that's already inside the same individual. That's very much like VDJ recombination. Okay. Other questions about this? Okay, great, great. So last kind of comments I want to make about this is that so now we can use a standard GA with regular old Python code or whatever you'd like. And so one example of this use, so application here, is a program called genprog, which came about because of a number of people, but one of them was Stephanie Forrest. And Stephanie Forrest is a faculty here at ASU. A relatively famous in her field faculty in complex systems and computer science for using methods like this to do very applied and useful things. GenProg, it sounds like generic, genetic programming. GenProg here is for automated software repair. And so what Stephanie and her group has shown is that you can take open source code for, if you, any program you've used in, at the Unix, at a bash shell or was the SH shell or whatever, most of those things are open source and you can mine through those. And she's taken those things and applied genprog to them and basically said, I need you to maintain the function of this code, but evolve different variations of it. And then sometimes she'll put different pressures on it. Like, for example, you don't always have to do repair. You can also do things like minimize energy usage. So you can actually have a way to measure every time you sort a bunch of lines of text, how much energy is actually being used at that, as an example. So there's all these objectives you can push on that. And what this is just an example, but what she's found is that genprog has the ability to find and correct latent bugs that others didn't even realize were there. So there was maybe some memory overflow that occasionally would happen, be so rare that nobody ever noticed. They would just rerun that program and so on and so forth. And she's actually been able to say, oh, we can find that and correct it. And so she can generate, new versions of software which are shorter than the other versions of software, which have fewer bugs and so on and so forth, just by allowing them to participate in these artificial populations that are being shaped by genetic programming. So that's, I think, pretty cool, like one application area there. Otherwise, there are other applications So people have applied this stuff to circuit design, for example. And this is particularly cool with FPGAs. So field programmable gate arrays. So this is basically these are these they call gate arrays because they're basically these arrays of wires where using semiconductors you can allow them to connect in points or break connections, and you can reprogram them over and over and over and over again. And it turns out that you can implement any logic operation you want using a field programmable gate array as long as it's sufficiently small to fit inside the array, which allows you to download new hardware, design hardware in software, and then very quickly have it implemented in hardware, and then have that hardware tested out in the real world. And so people have used things like genetic programming to put hardware in the loop, where you can actually have it evolve hardware and then pit them against each other. Other applications, and I've sort of hinted at this already, are medical decision trees. So you this is like these tree structures, both well, it's sort of like yeah, well, I guess I'll just say these tree structures, if you have a bunch of data about diagnoses that doctors have made, for example, you can, rather than just trying to build a neural network that can predict, given symptoms, what the outcome is, you can actually have it instead build the process. So how do I evolve a decision tree that best matches all of these data that I can then hand to a medical student and say, this is actually the tree where you'll be able to, when a patient comes in, to be able to classify what the likely diagnosis is. And so building these trees is another application that people have used these genetic programs for. And then finally, I want to mention then actually simulating, another application area is simulating complex evolutionary systems. And this is something that, for in a popular example, is Avita from Charles Ofria at Michigan State. And so in this particular case, they've created artificial organisms, which their DNA is basically code. And they basically allow the ones that they each little program has the ability to copy itself to actually reproduce inside the memory of this system. And so they don't have to define a fitness objective. It's already there as how many copies, it's like a virus, how many copies of that can you get into the rest of this system. And so these little organisms have evolved architectures that very efficiently copy themselves and interact with other organisms to create whole sort of ecological communities, all driven by the kind of evolutionary dynamics that's built off of the genetic program. Just again, without necessarily a fitness objective, it's just more built to kind of generate novelty. And so he's used that to demonstrate these kind of theoretical concepts that are hard to point to in nature, but people think exist, like punctuated equilibria and all that. He can show, well, here's an evolutionary system that actually exhibits that, and we can go back through it and see what happened and where it happened and so on and so forth. But anyways, that's where I want to stop. That's examples, all the cool things you can do with genetic programming. Next time, we'll show immunocomputing and then move on to kind of the next unit. So don't want to keep you any longer. Thanks for your patience. And thanks for your questions, as always.